And hello, Heart of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have Alan Miller, the brainchild behind Together, with us today. Alan, thanks so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Good to be here.
Great to have you. So much to discuss. And obviously, make sure and follow Alan. Those are his X handle and Together Declaration handles. And you can see the website details, everything. Make sure you're following and subscribing to what they're doing and kept up to breast, as I think Together Declaration, probably more than really anyone else, gives a fantastic snapshot, I think, of where we are in the UK in terms of freedom. So it's well worth, certainly for the US viewers, for the War and Posse, make sure and have a look, and you'll understand the dire totalitarian nature we are engaging in the UK. But before I jump, let me just bring, just for us in Hearts of Oak, thanks so much for all your support. And you can go over to Donor Box, Give, Saying, Go. Thank you for your £5 a month, £10 a month. We really do appreciate that. So I don't thank you enough. So there you go. There's my thank you. But Alan, Together Declaration, I mean, it has actually on the top, Together Association unites people throughout the UK to uphold freedom and fundamental democratic rights. You kind of think, well, I'm sure that we have great political parties that have been doing that for years and would have stood up in the COVID tyranny. But maybe to ask you, and I have had you on ages ago, but maybe just touch on that and then we'll get on to what's been happening more recently. Why is there any need for something like Together?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Peter. I mean, Thomas Paine's common sense, or the whole question of shared values that people historically from the right, whether it was Burke or others, or from the left and Rousseau, many of them would share these fundamental principles, right? They say, well, democracy is really important, free speech, free association. They may well, people historically have disagreed with how much the role of the state should play in the economy or not. And they were the clashes between left and right historically. What we've seen, I think, over the last 3 decades is an increasing amount of technocracy, bureaucrats that are authoritarian, that don't really, we kind of like don't have a relationship with the public, often think the public are not very nice, stupid. We hear sorts of words, dim, gammon, far right, sheep, all sorts of things from everyone, like many technocrats. And also their policies have become very, very insulting and lacking the idea that democracy and accountability and transparency is important. I mean, we saw much of this discussion in prior to lockdowns. We've seen it through the Brexit debates. We've seen it across the board, actually, where often the state thinks it's better intervening in people's private lives, increasingly in the family, with children. We've seen all sorts of things, like with what happened with the Tavistock clinic that's become apparent, and other things. But what happened was a range of issues all really manifested themselves during lockdowns, and it became very clear. I mean, it was difficult for anybody not to notice that Parliament was prorogued, that we had nightly sermons with very particular bits of data, that we were told that our fellow citizens were infectious, that we had to, be locked away, and we had, a reversal of the pandemic preparedness strategy, a reversal of centuries of medical outlook that, autonomy and decision making and informed consent. But with informed consent, you need the actual information that's correct as well. So all of these things became very problematized and were put on, we would argue it together. We were born in that. So we were born when we got together with about 150 different people, groups, campaigners, people of faith, secular people, businesses, grassroots campaigners, and we'd said, we need an umbrella organization that can really assert and articulate our freedoms, our liberty, and our rights, because they're under attack. And the fundamental principle was around free speech. It was around a challenge to lockdowns. It was, also in terms of our children, like why are this procedure being forced on children? We've now seen a lot of things since then, Peter, haven't we? We've seen like the lockdown files. We've seen what was Twitter, the Twitter files. We've seen that there were spy units, the rapid response unit from the cabinet, the British cabinet. We've seen that the counter disinformation unit targeting journalists, citizens, doctors, everybody not just shadow banning them, but actually censoring. There were smear tactics, a whole array of things, calling people all sorts of names. We were called a lot of names, you know, for asking questions and saying, surely we should be able to make decisions. We say, you know, it's irresponsible. You're going to kill people. You know, you're crazy, conspiracies, all these different things. Yet, as we've seen now with revelation upon revelation, it's, you know, the proof is in the pudding somewhat more, right, in terms of what was done. Now, some people still think, well, we needed to do those things. So some people will make that argument all the time for everything. Well, we need to have controls. You can't trust people. We need to be able to implement measures. And that's really why we carry on, because a lot of the questions around democracy and freedom and rights massively weaponized, suffocated and limited during the period of lockdowns. But in the discussions that continued, we've seen like emergency traffic orders that were brought in at the time of lockdowns, then roll out low traffic neighborhoods on the auspices of you must do this now. It's an absolute climate emergency. And it's about either, you know, clean air, which it patently is not about clean air. And we've done reports that people should look at our site with Ben Powell and looking at how actually there's a lot of interest, green billionaires who are underwriting really undemocratic work, because what you end up doing is pretending you're grassroots, having it massively funded, and then trying to capture local councils. And often there's not a debate and discussion of all those things, certainly not in Parliament. Like we were told, the science says it's all out. You must follow the rules. We're told that there's no more debate. The emergency's here. You must follow these rules, right? And so we find ourselves campaigning against net zero impositions on those bases, on, you know, around low emission zones and low traffic neighborhoods where there's been no consultations or very small ones. And when they do consult, they often ignore many people. They're not the right kind of people, as Sadiq Khan said, or they just ignore them. So we've got all these things that are happening, and you would think it would be common sense and really ordinary, but unfortunately, the Conservatives, Labour and the Lib Dems and Greens and SNP and everyone, and you've applied Cymru across Wales and Scotland, we've seen everywhere. In fact, in Wales and Scotland, we saw even more draconian measures during lockdowns. And, you know, when it comes to speed limits, 20 miles an hour across most places, that we don't care what it does to emergency vehicles. We don't want to, even having a conversation, Peter, even discussing it and raising the merit or the virtue of these things runs the risk of people being cancelled or called all sorts of things. We were working with lots of people who were challenging the ultra low emission zone, right, in London. So these are regular people in Britain. And the BBC said, well, it's like the far right are there. And what they actually meant was, and Sadiq Khan had been speaking with some senior BBC people and using this term all the time, but someone had a jacket with a little image, a kind of comic image of a cartoon with a little tash looking like Hitler with Sadiq Khan's face. So they were mimicking Sadiq Khan, which you're allowed to do in a free society. It's called humor, and criticism. People might not like it, but that's tough. But then it's repackaged and represented. But the one thing, having said about all of that, it should be common sense. The main parties, or people call them the Uni Party, often they've not been doing that. They've been doubling down, and we could talk a bit more, whether it's the Online Safety Act, whether it's to do with things like we might have to have banter police at work now, whether it's to do with sensitivity writers, a range of things, and publishing across the board, all these measures that are happening in terms of silencing, suffocating speech, limits to protest, right? We've had plenty of laws about stopping and implementing our laws against vandalism, against blocking motorways. They weren't done. Instead, we get brought in more laws that impact everyone. So you'd think it would be common sense, but it's not. And that's why we realized we'd have to continue campaigning and arguing. And we've done a number of campaigns where we get the public, we ask people like your viewers and across Britain to make their voices heard, write to their MPs, come on a rally, come on a protest, give out flyers, organize local groups, really make ourselves heard and felt. And not just, and this is true for whoever it is, don't just rely on other people, right? Let's try and make sure our democratic muscles are there, and that we have a responsibility and duty to do it. But particularly when Lucy Connolly's in prison and you see the kind of things that are going on, where, you know, certain speech is outlawed, certain people are not allowed to say and do things, others go, it's not without fear or favor. We really need the public to be active in all of that. So that's why we are here and continue.
I mean, you mentioned Lucy Connolly, and for the US viewers, she's someone who has been sentenced and languishing in jail for, I think, 30 months for a tweet that she took down quickly after. Um, but I've been really, really surprised at the utter lack of voices in Parliament, not only to her, but I think the Times of the Telegraph told us about 2 months ago about we have 30 arrests a day, in terms of things that you've said that are not allowed to be said, and there is no anger in Parliament from any party at people languishing in jail simply for putting a post up on social media.
I think it's scurrilous with the situation we've got. You know, on the one hand, Keir Starmer's saying to JD Vance and others, we've got a rich tradition of free speech. Well, we have got a rich tradition historically. Lots of people put their lives on the line. All sorts of things happened. Some people were tortured, some were killed, some went and fought other tyrants to maintain and uphold it. We're the beneficiaries of that. And yet, in a generation or two, and it should be said, it's happened with all of them. There's no, we've seen a situation where or you're not allowed to say that, or someone takes offense at that, or it causes them distress or harm. Words, as they say, like words of violence. Now they say silence is violence, even if you don't say anything. There's a whole range of things that we've seen, and you know, thousands of people are being arrested and some imprisoned for non-crime hate incidents. I mean, you couldn't make that term up, right? It's an Orwellian term, non-crime hate incidents. So who defines what is hateful? If you say to me, Alan, your beard looks silly, and I say, well, I haven't got a beard, I'm an orangutan. And then, like, you know, like just being silly for the sake of it, but you've now offended me in distress, you caused me harm, and I call it. Then we have this situation where in our everyday lives, in every aspect of them, it's increasingly surveyed, it's weaponized with what we think is increasingly a two-tier policing and judiciary system. We've just found out today that there's a proposal to have less trials by jury and just judges. I mean, there's an array of things that are happening that are really very concerning. And that's the thing, right? And I think the current people in Parliament have a duty and responsibility, but we have a duty to lobby them, to push them, hold them accountable. And a lot of new people are standing, right? We're seeing increasingly, you've seen the what people call the Trump phenomenon, but it's not that. It's populism, right? It's people that are fed up seeing things like, it's just not the British way, right? We don't want these things. The majority of the British people, they're fed up with being called names, said you can't say these things. The majority of British people, right? They want a state that can handle some things like reservoirs or, you know, infrastructure, but then get out of our lives, right? We need to be able to enjoy our private lives. We need to have a dynamic economy. I mean, we're in a really tricky position. Tens of thousands of millionaires leaving, lots of people coming in who like all want facility. And the British public are concerned about all these things. And yet often we're not allowed to discuss them openly, same as under lockdowns, right? You're called all these names, or you're presented as being a threat to, you know, ironically, that is the threat, as though a healthy democratic debate is a threat. So I think that I am encouraged by new people standing with, you know, whatever anyone thinks about any of the parties, something new's happening, right? There are new parties that are coming around. Some of them are very well known, some of them are smaller and less known. And this is going to be an opportunity for people who are concerned and want to have an impact to make that mark, because we've seen in just a year, right, 12 months, if you look at on everything that this government is trying to do or put in place, there's so many U-turns, there's kind of disagreement and rebellion within it. But, you know, they have a very small amount of people vote for them. They've not really put any of those things in the manifestos. So I think there's an opportunity for people who want to, like, the people are doing it locally with local councils and nationally, but it doesn't just mean going into conventional politics. It can mean campaigning, lobbying, doing something just locally with groups about issues that matter, but just getting the tonic, the health of our demos, the democratic, the public, really strong, and saying, you know, we're not just going to keep putting up with things like this. But I would also encourage people to stand on these issues as well as lobby their MPs and stuff like that.
I saw you put a letter up from which MP was it? Tom Gordon had
Oh, yeah.
written about digital IDs. You've got that. You've also got, I saw on my high street the other week, live facial recognition cameras by the police, and they can park wherever they like. They don't have to ask permission from the council. All of that, um, and you've got those intrusions into our lives, and we're all thinking, well, we didn't actually vote for any of this or ask for any of this, and yet we're told it will keep you safe. Kind of the same mantra that we saw during COVID is the same mantra behind digital IDs and also live facial recognition. Tell us a little bit about that, kind of how that's crept in and kind of how you're pushing back on that.
Yeah. So, well, what it is, Peter, is that if there's ever a problem today, we've got this ready-made solution. It's called digital ID.
Yep.
And we take a step back. Winston Churchill in 1952 said we wouldn't have national identity cards because that suffocates freedom. It's not the British way. And since, in the last few decades, again, we know that Tony Blair has really been trying to push them and his very powerful Tony Blair Institute, and they did not get put through. The British public, whenever we've been canvassed, have said we don't want it. But rather than doing what they did during lockdowns and say, right, well, it's Freedom Day, this is what gave birth to us, and Boris did, but we're going to have vaccine passports, and people were up in arms, and we'd had a campaign with thousands of hospitality venues, and then we got several 100,000 signatures challenging vaccine passports. It's very clear to people. Now what they're saying is, well, if you want to go to a bar and have fun and make it convenient, you can have digital ID. And you know what? If you're concerned about fraud, your digital ID will help it, security tracking. If you're concerned about crime, digital ID is great. If you're concerned about the borders, so the whole demographic they know are nervous about the state and everything. If you're concerned about borders and migration, well, digital ID will be good. And in an array of areas, it's presented as a convenient and sensible and easy and decent and impartial solution.
It's like the solution is more government.
Well, absolutely. And what I think the concerns are, there are a number of them, and you've pointed out some of them, but there was a discussion about this thing called the Brit card. That's a proposal. Ironically, there's this group called Labour Together, but like they're pushing that idea. But there's also a Gov UK digital wallet that is just kind of going along, and they've recently, at the Department of Science and Technology, we've shared some of the posts because they've started pushing some of the digital ID bits, and people should take a look at that. Across the board, there's a push for it. Now, we know that in terms of cash, central bank digital currency, the EU is having one. 27 other nations have got them. There's a push to do it. The CEO of the Bank of International Settlement said we can track every single transaction and watch everything that goes on. A lot of old people can't. My mum can't get on apps and the internet. Lots of people, and it's difficult enough at banks. We campaigned to have more ATMs, banks kept open, and cash. We did that with the Bank of England and the FCA. They responded. It was a great consultation. Lots of our people, I'm sure some of your viewers, many people wrote in for that, and thanks to everyone that did. But whether it's cash, a central bank digital currency, or whether it's just having digital ID expected consistently, and then there's all sorts of questions around it. We know that online speech, or the Online Safety Act, what's happened with that, with 6 people turning up to your house for putting out a post when they can't turn up for burglaries. And this is the other thing about the irony about crime. We have CCTV cameras everywhere, and yet crime's up, and the ability to handle and be willing to implement authority seems to have vanished. Right. So it's not just because you've got a load of technology everywhere, it doesn't mean you're going to resolve antisocial behavior or those issues on the street. What it does mean is you end up tracking and surveilling people. And some people are obsessed with it. Some people are obsessed with it. It's a technocrat's dream, right? Oh, where is everyone? What they're doing, ever more granular, boiling it down. And then imagine that, the NHS has now got a lot of people on the app. Palantir are the people doing the technology. It was like basically the CIA and tracking for people in COVID lockdowns. The whole idea that all aspects of our identity are managed through this ID card, and then when you get rewards and punishments, you get nudged. You may have a new kind of health suggestion or a vaccine suggestion that may result in you getting incentives for work or not, or if you're using too much of a carbon footprint because you're going on holiday or driving your car a bit too much, or just driving around and the LTNs and tracking and viewing you and fines, building up a bit like a social credit system where Big Brother, where the state is like looking down on the activities. And people say, well, that's far-fetched, right? We're not really, you're pushing it a little bit much. It's a bit Brave New World. It's a bit Orwellian. So we look at what's happened in the last few years, right? Not just lockdowns and spies and censors, but, you know, people being imprisoned for social media posts, people having the police come around their houses for it, for some types of posts, not for all posts, because obviously the CEO of Hope Not Hate did not go to prison for his post that he deleted. And I don't think he should. I don't think any of them, well, like, unless you directly, there are rules that we've got already for specific incitement. But then, you know, I think we need to have some free speech absolutism. We can get onto that. But just like, you've got to have it for people you really abhor and ideas you abhor. We've got to be able to thrash them out democratically. But the problem with the digital ID situation, forced digital ID, is in every arena of our lives, it's ever more control and surveillance and tracking. And so we're concerned with that. We're saying we need to be able to ring fence privacies and our liberties and freedom. We need to not just have a discussion in Britain, but we should have this in place so that there are very clear rules and boundaries, right? Because we've seen with the government and big tech and the relationship and what's happened and just snooping on people. And we want to make sure that they're clear, that it's not this panacea of brilliant things, that there's all sorts of severe questions and concerns about it. And this is not some crank obsession, right? Our freedom and liberty and rights are paramount. They're fundamental, because people point at other countries. And I used to think, gosh, I think about something like Milan Kundera's The Joke, and he tells the joke, and then it's under, you know, the Soviet system, and he's imprisoned, and you think, gosh, it's just so horrendous. And it's a beautiful, haunting book. And then you think, well, some of the things that are going on here are not dissimilar. And that is terrifying, right? The idea that we now in Britain, where I used to think, well, you know, it's a remarkable country, it still is a remarkable country, but for lots of reasons. And yet we now have this move towards a more controlling, surveying, limiting, tracking society, and digital ID is really seen by many of them as the ultimate way of doing that. Now, I just want to say, it doesn't mean that we can't have certain things, right? I think we can have some digital health records, but how we ring fence them, how we protect people, the rules we have, then the state or others, when they encroach on that, can be held accountable, right? So that's the thing. We have to discuss these things through. We have to make it clear. We have to make boundaries and parameters. Like if they phone tap you or if they read your mail in the past, you'd have to have a warrant. You'd have to have specific things, and it might well be legitimate in certain circumstances, right? You say, well, for you know, and that would be the discussion. But you can't just willy-nilly do it to everyone based on that. And we've seen people being debanked for their political views. And, you know, if you can't bank, you can't really operate society. And certainly if you can't speak freely, we can't be free in society. So for all those reasons, we'd encourage everyone to get involved with us on that campaign, because we think it's really important. We're going to do a lot of stuff over the next period.
But it's also, and of course, I'd encourage everyone to do that and be a part of what you're doing, because, as the name says, together we actually can do a lot more than we can do separately. But it's also the access that we think whenever we go to the DVLA to register your car, if you go to the hospital and have your records or wherever it is, actually that information is for that department, for the government. And then you realize that if you go and look at all the organizations and entities that are allowed access to that, and the concerns health records, well, would the police get access? Would insurance companies get access? On the digital or the, if you have a spending money digitally with a Brit point, then maybe what about health company? What about insurance companies accessing what you buy and therefore making a decision on health? And it's that intrusion into, that's none of your business. And yet the government seems to be able to pass our data out freely or even sell our data.
Absolutely. And look, lots of people are concerned, quite rightly, I think, about things like benefits, right? Not just fraud, but how many benefits. And I'm concerned about how much people get paid, how much profits companies can make, right? And how they can still exist in Britain under all this pressure. But what we're seeing is technocrats saying, well, we'll have unelected civil servants who can go into bank accounts to take out money, in, you know, and the Department for Work and Pensions being able to do this. And you think, well, no, that's not the solution. Then the solution is not for citizens just when they think they decide to come in and come out and do stuff out of our accounts, or as you say, looking at us in the round in all our our activities, our privacy, our much of our private lives and data. Then there's also obviously the more banal but really important things like data breaches, data leaks, power systems going down. If everyone's on a digital ID and a digital currency, how are we trading, right? What if we've had energy security has been a real big issue in Britain, right? And for many reasons, because we haven't been sensible about it, like food security and with farmers, and we're doing stuff for them too. But if all those things happen, like we've seen just in Europe recently, where power grids gone down and all of that, partly because of net zero, that has massive consequences, as well as cyber attacks, security attacks, all those things. So all of these things should give everyone pause to reflect on it. And we know that we've changed legislation already with the government, with stopping things like livable street funding for low traffic neighborhoods, with challenging the Bank of England on some of these measures I talked about, on the FCA and debanking, and a range of things have had an impact, right? So we haven't won everything. The assisted suicide bill went through. We fought for it, but it's still going to Lords. But even the act of campaigning, if you fight and you lose, that's still better than not having done anything at all. And along the road, you build new relationships, you have the debate with the public more, and that's important historically, right? Because without sounding too grandiose, historically all sorts of things have happened, and sometimes people who've lost before, but they set a precedent or they put some things in place that then get referenced back, or people you carry the light and the torch that then can help pushing forward things for things like individual conscience, which is a very modern thing in modern society. It never used to be the case. Our private views that could be different to authority, and we really need to protect and retain that.
Tell me about Montgomery Tom's. You mentioned free speech absolutism, and I'm 100% with that. He needed 11 police officers, someone who's involved with Together. Sounds like a dangerous individual that needs 11 police officers. Fill us in, especially for maybe the US viewers who may not have been aware of what happened and who this really exceptionally dangerous person is and what he did.
So Montgomery Tom's went with a sandwich board type placard that basically trans equals mental illness, and basically he put that point. That's his view, and he put it there. And it's like some people may go to pro-abortion or pro-life demonstrations, and some people get very offended, and I understand there's very deep-seated convictions on both sides of the arguments. But like with the assisted suicide bill, right, I think that many people are of good intentions on both sides of those arguments, but people get very emotive about it, and that's fine. But you can't have a situation where one side gets to say those things and not the other, whoever it is, whether we like them or not, because if that starts happening arbitrarily, then we're all doomed. Because today it will be Monty with his placard, tomorrow it will be the farmers, then it will be all the people. And I think some others are seeing that those are what they now call the left, are seeing what that means. They've called for people to be cancelled and censored for a long time, and now some of them are. And I know this might be controversial to your views. I'm not a fan of anyone being censored. I think that if you do acts that are already illegal, you should be held accountable fully for them under law. But for saying things and rallying and protesting, I don't think you should. I think you should be able to mock and criticize those things. But so what happened was he went along to, there's a couple of pride demonstrations that are happening now, but he went along to one on the weekend with a sandwich board. He likes to talk to people and all of different views as it happens. And he's been to a couple of other ones like Just Stop Oil and I think XR in the past, as well as some of the what you call freedom rallies. And he was told by the police that isn't okay. And people use words like distress or alarm or harm. And he then said, well, all right, I'm going to go over here then. So he went and he walked away, and he was 2 streets down parallel. And then the police followed him, and they said, and then there was 9 and then another 2. So it was 11 in total. So obviously they had an intention there, and they said, you need to take this off. He said, well, I'm not near the protest now, but I'm not taking it off. This is my right. And, in Britain and in England, freedom of speech. And they said, well, if you don't take it off, we're going to arrest you. So that's what ended up happening. He was very calm and resolute. We can post it again, I guess, in your thread and everything. He was very calm. The irony of all this is had well over 1 million views, that original video, and many more people have commented on it. It's quite a lot over the press now, as it should be. There was also a chap in Leeds that happened to say to a protest, look, if you're so pro this particular view, it happened to be a Palestine march, why don't you go and fight there? And he was also arrested. He was arrested for breach of the peace, but because he said he wasn't going to leave as well. He said, it's my right to speak here. There were also some people that were arrested on the weekend, and some people in London on the Palestine demo. Some people will say, well, that's good that they're arresting some of them. And I get the instinct, certainly if they're doing some of the things that some of them had done before, not about speaking or marching or waving a flag, but other things, right, that are illegal already. But some were arrested for holding placards. And that's a problem for us all, because as I said, if you can't say, well, Monty should be able to do it if they can't. And none of them, either we all have it. And that's the thing about policing without fear or favor. That's the thing about Hendon Policing Training College, with the obsession with DEI and with ESG and a very particular outlet. When you say something about trans issues, or if you say something about borders, you're immediately presented as this thing that's dangerous and beyond the pale. Remember the Southport, the summer of Southport. I mean, just incredible, right? And how we were, as a public, talked about what Keir Starmer was threatening as a prosecutor in chief, people being arrested for things that they'd posted. And so that's what happened with Monty. And then he basically was put in a cell for about 10 hours and he was released without a charge, but with a 3-month prevention, it's an exclusion from Westminster, which Westminster is where some of the news guys are. Obviously, I've met you in Westminster and Parliament Square. We're often in Westminster around Parliament, having meetings in offices. So that's a big problem. It is being challenged. We're all getting it challenged at the moment. And we're working with like the Free Speech Union, who are brilliant, and others, and we like that's being challenged. But the very idea that you silence someone for something like that, and a couple of comments have said, well, he should have known, and it was in breach of the Public Order Act Section 5, and Section 5 is like harassment and distress. As I said, Pete, you could say to me, Alan, that's a terrible T-shirt, and many would agree with you, some might not, but then if I start saying, well, you caused me harassment and distress, and then you need to be arrested for that, we are done. Yep. And so I would try and remind everyone that even if they think, well, maybe he should have done a counter protest. Well, that was his counter protest. And actually, I don't want to be the one. I don't want people to ask me or anyone else how people should or shouldn't decide to raise their convictions. Or what I want to be able to do is discuss them in the public square with everyone and try and convince people that what I think about them are right. But listen to people as well, get better to understand why they think these things, and have a healthy public debate. And so the irony of these weak authoritarians, you see, like the Met Police, South Yorkshire Police, many police forces who can't do burglaries, right? You can't. People don't call them anymore. You got to say you got a gun, or you got to say they're being transphobe. And I joke slightly about that, but coming down the pipeline, the next bit of legislation is going to be about Islamophobia, right? Phobias, all these phobias people have got, and we're going to legislate against them. And we need to be very clear and vigilant that these are dangerous times. And even though there's a really good populist pushback that I've said in the States, and what's been happening here somewhat, we are not done, right? And there's strong ideological, I would say, capture of many of our institutions, not just the public sphere, not just the unions and the NHS, but in the private sphere as well. ESG, particularly DEI, and all these things you have to say and do at work and everything. Every part of our lives. So you unthink certain things, you don't say certain things. And that's something that we all need to be able to address and challenge. And we encourage everyone to do that together, of course.
No, and I could talk to you for a whole program about the Islamophobia stuff, but on Montgomery, it was similar to, I guess, Billboard Chris and Lois McClatchy Miller, but they were arrested over in Belgium, and you realize this is across the board. It's not just our police training in Hendon, but it seems to be that's been exported elsewhere. And how do we, because the police enforce, and either it's the fault of politicians for writing a bill that's so wide that they have to run around and do this, or else the fault of the police for deciding that someone may be offended or be hurt by that. They could say, well, that wouldn't offend anyone, and therefore they are not there. So where does the fault lie, and how do you win back what we need for freedoms on both of those angles?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, just to say as a footnote to all of this, the discussion that we're all vulnerable and at risk, and like somehow being offended with some is the same as being hit over the head. It patently is not. And it's really important we keep the distinction. And when people say words of violence, no, violence is violence, and we have laws about that. And you can't just go around beating people up, and we'd be in a terrible state if you could do that. But you can have a punch up with words, right? You must be able to ridicule, criticize, lampoon, seriously debate, have tabloids, gutter journalism. You've got to have everything, because if you don't have some of it, you can't have any of it. And so I think that principle is really key. And it was a brilliant question. Just remind me of the key point you wanted to me.
No, it's just with the police and the government, and where's the fault lying?
Yeah. So I think the thing is, what's happened is that for many years, this idea that we're vulnerable and at risk and need a therapeutic state to intervene and look after us, and the state's taken an ever bigger role in our private lives and in the public sphere, but done less and less things like nuclear energy or new reservoirs or whatever. So that's happened. And then also the policing colleges, this is not rank and file officers. They get told these new measures, right? And they have to go along with them. Many of them are really uncomfortable. And we're working with Harry Miller from We Are Fair Cop. We've done a video with him up at Northumbria, him lampooning, very brave, lampooning their positions on the trans issue and all of that, and handcuffing himself to the fence there and calling them out, and also doing legal cases. But there, you can see that what's happened in the institution is that some of the people that are running it, the chiefs, have become imbued and imbibed with this. And then it gets ordered across the line. This is what hate speech is, or these are the haters. This is what it looks like. So, it's ironic, because if you just take the trans issue, many people in what was LGB, and the women that were feminists, or women that were lesbians, or men that were gay men, and many people fought many years what was then the left against those things, right? And were successful in the end. And then what happens is this new thing comes along, and it's ousted most of them. And then many of them are not allowed in the whole formal parts of Pride, and because they don't, if they think a single sex, and that a man loves a man, and they're like, that's discriminatory now, or it could be far right. And you've got this mad situation. But to see how problematic it is that even when like the police or politicians and all of them go forever more, because it is the fact that politicians in the last 30 years are increasingly technocratic. They want to make more laws, more rules, and we've seen lawfare working through. And then the police's role and remit is to police, but rather than doing it that for your favor, they've got this new criteria and this new teaching methods and this new thing about non-crime hate incidents and offense and stress and harassment. And rather than saying, well, look, there's all these burglaries are going on and we've got a terrible rate of fixing them, you get directives and objectives to manage ideas or stop hate crimes. So it's the worst of both situations. And I think in each area, we need to address them and deal with them. And we need to, say that about what's going on with policing in Britain and weaponizing the judiciary as well. And we need to hold our politicians and the institutions to account. I mean, really, in truth, Peter, I think that the civil service and a lot of our institutions, we need to have a real, not just revamp, slash a lot of it and address these issues of DEI and ESG and say, let's get back to basics, key principles about wealth creation, protecting sovereignty, making sure we're strong and dynamic, that, we've got amazing values and virtues in this country. If people aren't just telling us all the time how terrible we've been and we're all evil and it's all, and that somehow some other things are better than that. And, I think that that's across education, and obviously the unions and some of the institutions all are sharing in these ideas. What happened was some of the trans activists were brilliant at not having a public debate, but just basically getting control and having an impact in some institutions. And I think that is true of some of those other technocratic ideas. But what's happened is when the public get to hear about this and see it, they don't go along with it. So then you see, and that's where I think that's where the real inspiration comes from for me, that, that you bring it and you make it clear, you shine the light on it, you open it up for debate, and you say, look, the public can decide this, and we put pressure on it because all those people are relying on getting voted in. And if they can't, they won't be. And it does have an impact on them. So I think, it's a fight that's gone on for some time, the fight for free speech, ever since it came around. But we have to maintain it. And what happened to Monty and others this weekend, should give us pause again. But like we'd encourage everyone to get involved with togetherdeclaration.org and get involved locally, regionally, nationally, and make our voices. So don't just think it's inevitable, it's all going to happen. We can shape it and make a difference.
100%. It's a great place to leave it, to make sure and be part of that. We don't even have time for banter, please. If you want to know what's happening there, make sure and go on to Together Declaration or Alan's feed, and you'll see all of that which is happening. There's no end to the levels this government will do to shut down any conversations. Alan, really appreciate you coming on. What Together are doing fantastic, and I just wanted you on to give a snapshot of some of those attacks on freedoms that we face, and you're at the forefront of pushing back on that. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Peter, for having us. Very kind of you, and appreciate it.